Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee Workshop. Recently we paid a visit to the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. Its 200 rooms are filled with art, tapestries, and furniture, which is what brought us there, as you'll see next, right here in the new Yankee Workshop.
The new Yankee Workshop features the craftsmanship of Norm Abram.
This is the largest private residence ever built in the United States. It has over 4 acres of floor space, 250 rooms. It took 1,000 artisans 6 years to build it in 1895, and as you would expect, it's filled with treasures. Ah, isn't this civilized? A beautiful library, all built out of walnut, with over 10,000 volumes, most of them leather-bound. Now I've looked and I can't find any of my volumes. I can give them that. And how's that for a fireplace to sit by and read? That's George Washington Vanderbilt, the man who built this beautiful estate, and he looks down over the tapestry gallery. Ancient tapestries hang between these intricately carved limestone fireplaces. The furniture here is also heavily carved and a little bit ornate, not something we usually build in the new Yankee Workshop. Now, guests would stay here for a week or longer, so if you grew tired of reading or strolling in the garden and you wanted a little bit more violent exercise, you could head downstairs. There's plenty to keep you entertained here at the Biltmore Estate. Look at this, a solid oak ping pong table. Now, down this hallway, there's a nice sofa on one side and some photos on the other wall, a Roman emperor, Roman athlete, and a Roman soldier, which should put you in the mood for some more serious athletics. Over here, we have a nice quarter-sawn oak floor that leads to 2 bowling lanes. Wooden bowling pins down at the other end, wooden bowling balls here. Now, if bowling isn't your thing, there's more. Would you like to have one of these in your house? A private indoor swimming pool, beautifully tiled with a wooden diving platform down the other end. A place you could hang out with your 50 closest friends. And if the water gets a little too chilly, you just come over here and add a little more hot. Now here we're talking about a real workout, pain. I could spend some time with the Indian clubs. After that, hit the rowing machine for a few miles, and then on to the weights. But I better think about taking a shower and getting ready for dinner. Well, after you've taken your shower, you're going to need a dressing room, and there are several of them here. This one has a piece that I really like. It's a cheval mirror, just like the one I built on the new Yankee Workshop a few years ago. But here's the piece I wanted you to see. It's a dressing table. On the top of it, we actually see some toiletries that belong to Cornelia Vanderbilt. Now, this is a 19th century reproduction of a Sheraton piece. The mirror folds into the top, and then the top comes down to conceal it. It matches the rest of the top. It has a couple drawers and some turned and carved legs with brass casters on the bottom. This is a nicely sized piece for today's bedroom. So if you can't have the swimming pool or the bowling alley, you can have one of these. Well, here's our version of that dressing table. It's a close copy of the one that we found at Biltmore. Most people would consider this piece Federal or Sheraton, after Thomas Sheraton, the English cabinet maker who did his work in the late 18th and early 19th century. His pieces often featured vase-shaped legs. We were able to find some solid brass casters, just like the original, and some knobs for the drawer that were appropriate for a Sheraton piece. The top on the original was inlaid. Here we're using veneer core plywood. There's some nice features to this piece. The center section lifts up to reveal a mirror, which you can use while seated. But if you want, you can also pull the mirror out and prop it up in an angle to use it while standing. If you'd like to build a version of our dressing table, a measure drawing is available with the materials list and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. I want to start today by making the legs. Before we do any woodworking, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Let me show you how I got started. Each leg has a square portion at the top and a turned portion the rest of the way. The first thing I want to do is make a score around all four sides of the blank to prevent tear out when I get to the lathe. So I've set up a stop block and the saw at a shallow cut. I'll guide the piece through with my miter gauge. With 8 legs to make for the prototype and the piece we're building today, I turned to my lathe duplicator. I made a template of the turning on a piece of hardboard and mounted it on the lathe duplicator. The way it works is that there is a cutter on this end and a follower down here. You keep moving closer and closer to the piece until the follower hits the template. It takes about 10 passes to turn a leg. If there's one disadvantage to the lathe duplicator, it's that the cutter is pointed, which means I can't get a perfectly square cut on the bottom of this portion. Now, I can do it with traditional tools, but I need a tool rest, which would mean I'd have to remove the duplicator if I want to do it from this side, and I don't want to do that. Fortunately, this lathe has a reverse function, so I can come over to the other side, set a tool rest, and complete the turning. One more thing that I want to do from this side is just tune up the very bottom of the leg, because I want to make sure that that brass foot is going to fit on before I sand everything down. And that will go on when I'm ready. So now we're ready for sanding. The rails of the table are going to be joined to the legs with mortise and tenon joinery. Each rail will have a tenon that fits into a mortise. To make these mortises, I'm using my stationary mortiser. You've seen me use this before. It has a 3/8" chisel, a drill bit in the middle. The drill does most of the work. The chisel squares it up. If you look here at the leg on the prototype, I want to show you a detail. There's this little rib. It's a half-round piece that runs around the leg and along the bottom edge of the rails. If I tried to attach such a small piece with brads, it would probably split. So I'm going to make a groove in the leg into which I can glue these pieces. To make that groove, I set up the dado head for 1/4 inch, installed the stop block, and attached another piece to my miter gauge to help guide it through. Here's one of those end rails. I've set up a stop block and adjusted the fence for a 1-inch long tenon. I'm going to use my miter gauge to guide the pieces through, making a shoulder cut on each side. Without changing the setup, I now want to make a shoulder cut on each edge of the solid pieces and nibble away the material right to the end. With the saw blade raised to a 1/2 inch, I'm going to make a saw cut on the top edges of the side rails and nibble away the material. Now for the cheek cuts. The best way to make cheek cuts for tenons is to use a tenoning jig like this one. It holds the piece securely so I can run it through the saw in a vertical position. Back at the mortising machine, This is a mortise in those front rails to receive the divider between the drawers. Let's take another look at the prototype. If you look closely along this back edge, there's a solid piece of mahogany on top of the plywood rail because that edge shows when the mirror is open. So I've taken the back rail, rolled on some glue. I have a piece of solid mahogany that I'm going to attach with some brads. I've machined some tenons on a small piece of mahogany that will fit into those mortises that I just made to divide the drawers. Now let's take another look at the prototype. I've removed the drawers, and I'm going to remove this right side of the top so I could show you how it all goes together. There's a big piece of plywood in the middle for the work surface. There's 2 plywood cleats on each end which will support and guide the drawers, as well as 1 in the middle. All these pieces are connected with biscuits. These notches on the draw support allow it to fit around the legs. These solid pieces act as side guides for the drawers. Glue and brads hold them in place. This is the center support for the drawers, and 1 piece of plywood down the middle will guide both of them. Well, finally, we're ready for a little assembly. I'm applying a coat of glue to the tenon, and I've already put some glue in the mortise for the short rails. We'll clamp these up. Now a little glue on that divider between the drawers, and we'll clamp that up. All right. Now I'm putting all the parts together that we made those biscuit slots for. A little bit of glue in each biscuit slot and a number 10 biscuit. And this is that center panel. Goes in first. Okay. Now one of those end draw supports and guides. And here's the center support and guide. And now the one on the other end. That one in. That. Now this is one of the top guides. Okay, and the one on this side. Now we'll do the same thing and attach the front rails. Here I've been applying glue in the mortises of the end assemblies I made earlier. We slip all these pieces together and clamp it up. All right. Pull that nice and tight together. Set it aside. Tomorrow's another day. Well, good morning. I got started today by working on some of the details of the base of our dressing table. I removed the clamps, sanded everything down, and now I'm installing this decorative rib or bead that goes all the way around the rails and the legs. The piece on the rails gets nailed on from underneath, but these tiny little pieces that fit around the legs are secured with glue only. And this is where that little groove that I machined in the leg comes in handy. It holds the piece at exactly the right height. And we just tap it in, clean off any glue, and that's all there is to it. Now let me show you how I made these bead pieces. The stock that I'm using for that bead starts out as 1/4 inch thick mahogany, a little bit wider than what I need. I've installed a 1/4 inch beading bit in the router, but I'm just using the half round portion. A feather board helps to keep the stock tight to the table. I just machine one edge. Now I can rip the pieces to the correct width. I've set the rip fence, and here it's absolutely critical to use a push stick for safety. Now I just take the piece I machined, slide it in the slot of the leg, then come down the other end, reach around, and put a mark at the back of that slot. I like to cut all these pieces, both the square cuts and the miters, at the table saw with my miter gauge. I can see the marks better, especially on those really small pieces. It makes it a lot safer. With the piece in the right position, I want to mark the inside miter. And I found the best way to do that is to take a sharp pencil and just put a dot at the intersection. Back to the saw. Swing my miter gauge around to 45 degrees and make the cuts. A little bit of glue on the edge of this trim piece, and slip it into the grooves and line it up. And here I will use some nails because they're on the underside and I won't see them. And the piece is wide enough so it won't split. Let's trim out this leg. Same bead, a narrower piece of stock. I've already cut a miter on one end, so I'll just slide the piece in up against the miter of the other piece and mark the length at the back of the groove. Now here's where an extension on my miter gauge helps. I can bring the mark up to the face, and you can see here I've made a pass through the saw, and I've drawn a line up exactly where the saw blade cuts. So now I bring the mark from the piece to the mark on the gauge, and I can cut that tiny little piece. Now there's still a tiny little splinter right on the edge there. I could trim that away with a utility knife. And you can imagine how difficult and dangerous this would be to do at a power miter box. Now we just slip it in there, dry for the moment. Take another piece which has been mitered on one end. Get it in the right place. It's really just a matter of fit and cut. It takes a while. Now let's build a couple of drawers, and let me remind you of what they look like. They're all solid mahogany, and the sides are joined to the front with dovetails. The front is a piece of plywood wrapped in a very small 1/8 inch thick bead piece, just like the detail I did on the bottom of the rails and legs. I want to do that job first. Wrap the plywood. I can nail the long pieces, but the end pieces can only be installed with glue because I don't want to cut nails when I mill the dovetails. Here at the router table, I've switched over to a 1/16 inch radius round over bit or beading bit to make this delicate bead. I've carefully mitered all the pieces that wrap the piece of plywood for the draw front at the table saw. Now I've just rolled a bit of glue on the edge, and I just want to line up my corner and secure the long pieces with some brads. Now when it comes to these little short end pieces, just a little bit of glue, no nails, because that's where I'm going to machine the dovetails later. Okay, we'll just set this aside to dry. Let's take another look at the prototype drawer. The back is joined to the sides in a dado joint. So I've set up the dado for a 1/2 inch width 1/4 of an inch above the table, and I've set a stop block so I won't get any kickback when I run the pieces through. All 4 sides of the drawer get a groove for the plywood bottom. It has to be 1/4 inch wide, so I've reduced the width of the dado, and now I'll just run the pieces through. Now for the dovetails. We like to use a dovetailing jig. There are a series of fingers on the jig that I can adjust for just about any dovetail layout that I want. And by using that in conjunction with a router, which has a dovetailing bit, and a collar, which follows these fingers, I get perfectly fitting dovetails. I start with the side pieces, with the inside facing out. I make sure that there's a backer board behind the piece, and by following the fingers, I'll get the dovetails, and no tear out. Now I've installed the drawer front in the top of the jig. And I've put this backer block in. Normally I don't put those in because I'm working with end grain on the drawer front. But because I have this thin strip of trim, the rotation of the bit may cause it to tear away. So I'm fully backing it up. The next step is to take the jig and flip it over, which puts it in the pin mode. I slide it in and set it on the thickness of the side pieces, which in this case is a 1/2 inch, and then I'm ready to machine pins in the drawer front. Now we're ready for some assembly, and all I need is glue with this type of joint. That's one of the nice advantages of a dovetail joint. There's a lot of glue surface to get around all these edges. And because of the shape of it, the drawer front is not going to pull off of the side. I just slip the pieces together and wipe off the excess glue. Not only is it strong, but it looks great. With a little bit of glue in the dados for the back, I can slip in the bottom, which is not glued in place, just floats. And once that's in, we'll slip the back on and nail it. Okay, a few 1-inch brads will hold it all together. Okay, now we can take the assembled drawers and slide them into the base. I want the front, that bead, to be about 1/8 of an inch beyond the rails and nice and straight. So I set both of them in place, and then I'm taking some scrap blocks of plywood, applying a little bit of glue, and I'm going to set those up on the supports right up against the side of the drawer. One on each side will make sure they're in the right place. All right, well that takes care of part 1 of our 2-part program to build the dressing table. It's coming along nicely. Now next time we'll make the top, the mirror assembly, do some finish, install the hardware, and we have a treat for you. We're going to show you how they make hardwood plywood, just like this mahogany. That's next time, right here in the new Yankee Workshop. Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee Workshop. Last time we started building this dressing table. The inspiration came from an antique we found at the fabulous Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. This time we'll finish building the project and apply a nice finish to it. In addition to that, we have a special treat, a tour of a hardwood plywood factory. All that's next, right here in the new Yankee Workshop. What a beautiful day to complete our dressing table. If you'd like to build your own version, a measure drawing is available with the materials list, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. I want to get started today working on the top. Each section has 2 elements, a top made out of plywood edged in solid wood, and a subframe to give it some thickness. The subframe is made up of 5/8 inch thick, 1.5 inch wide mahogany, and all the corners are mitered. I make the miter cuts over at the table saw. Now there are a lot of different size pieces for these frames, so I put an extension on my miter gauge, clipped off the end, measured from that point, and put indicator marks for all the different sizes that I need. I clip one end, turn it around, cut it to length. Now before we use any power tools, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. To reinforce the miter joints, I'm cutting biscuit slots. I found it better to put the plate joiner in a vise with these small pieces. I had to change the cutter in the plate joiner because I'm using these very small FF biscuits, which are handy for narrow pieces. When I assemble, I'll put in a little bit of glue, and that's going to make a very strong joint. For the assembly of the frames, a little bit of glue in those slots and on the biscuits. I've set them in clamps and made sure that the edges are parallel to one another by measuring across. Now I want to check for squareness, so I take diagonal measurements. Here I have 28 9/16. Here I have 28.5, so I want to split the difference. This should be about 28.5 strong, so I'll tap this corner. Give it a couple taps. And that should do it. Now we'll set it aside to dry. These pieces are for the mirror frame. It's the same stock as the subframe. I've mitered the corners and made slots for biscuits. I also need a rabbet to receive the mirror and the backer. So I've set up my dado cutter with a sacrificial strip and a featherboard to hold everything tight to the table. Now for the plywood. I'm going to be using this piece for the top of the dressing table, but I pulled out 2 full sheets because this is special plywood. If you look at the grain, you can see that it's matched one piece to the next. These veneers were actually sliced out of a log in sequential order. And when it was applied to the sheets, they numbered the sheets in sequential order. So if you were to line a room with this material, it would have a very uniform grain to it. Now, plywood is an interesting product. It has 2 skins on the outside, the fancy wood, the high-quality hardwoods or even exotic woods. And it's very thin because you don't want to use any more than you have to. The core is made up, in this case, of poplar. It's a secondary wood. Now, we visited a national forest just outside of Asheville, North Carolina, where they grow poplar trees, not far from the Biltmore Estate where we found the dressing table. Well, I thought it was high time that you took a look at your land in North Carolina. That's right, you're looking at National Forest right off the Blue Ridge Parkway, and we're at a spot called Stony Bald. It's primarily a hardwood forest, red oak, ash, cherry, and there's a lot of poplar. Now, the poplar is very interesting, as we found out from forester Eric Berg. Now, Eric, you're a Forest Service researcher, and you have the daunting task of taking care of this timberland just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. Why did you bring me to this plot today?
Norm, it's because we have 70 years of history here. We actually conducted an experiment here. We cut the forest to see how it would grow back.
Why did you do that?
Norm, back in the 1920s, the hardwood quality here was very poor. And so we wanted to see if it could be improved. So we cleared the trees to find out what would happen.
What did you do to bring it back? I mean, it looks great. It's pretty thick.
Norm, we actually did nothing. This response is all natural.
Really? Now, what kind of tree is this?
This is yellow poplar.
Nice and straight and tall. I've worked with this wood. It's great to work with. So it grows quickly?
Grows very fast, yes.
And it's tight together, so you get a good yield.
That's exactly right. Because it grows so straight and tall and has a narrow crown, you can get very high yields.
Now, let's say I want to buy this tree. Can I do that?
Norm, you really want to do that? I used to have hair before I used to get into this process, let me tell you. It's quite involved.
It's that tough?
Very much so. There's a long paper process to get to the point before we can sell National Forest timber.
So what happens?
Well, basically, we have to assess the environmental impacts of a timber sale on this site. That whole process can take years, a lot of paperwork. Then we finally have a decision made by our deciding official, David Loftus, the project leader, and his action can be appealed by the public. In addition, we can be taken to court. We can be litigated.
Hey, I just want to buy one tree for some projects. Let's assume I get through all of that. What happens next?
If you're successful, what happens next is that we'll designate which trees are to be removed. And then those trees, those logs, will be moved uphill with a line skidder to a road above to minimize the damages down here.
Because you want to let these other trees mature even more.
Precisely. We don't want any damage to the trail down here in the bottom as
All
well.
right. So how much is this tree worth? What's it going to cost?
On the stump today, this is worth roughly $100. By the time it gets to the mill, $200.
And what about if it becomes core for some plywood I might be buying?
Then you're going to pay the big bucks, Norm.
Really?
All right, Terry, send her down. We're ready.
Not far from where we saw the trees growing, we visited a logging operation where timber was being harvested to make plywood. It was interesting the way they did it. A tall steel pole is erected and equipped with a winch and a cable, which leads down the hill to the freshly cut trees. With power applied to the cable,
Pull.
a whole tree is then dragged uphill to the logging road. It's a much easier and gentler system than alternative methods, which involve tracked vehicles and having to build a lot of additional roads. Once the logs have been gathered onto trucks, it's a short ride over to the plywood mill. In order to understand how plywood is made, we've come to Old Fort, North Carolina. All of these logs are yellow poplar. That big machine moves them around, takes them to another location where the bark is removed and they're cut to length. Jeff Tuckey, the plant manager, points out that none of the bark, the chips, or the sawdust will go to waste. A lot of it ends up being made into particle board or paper products. Here, the debarked logs are bathed in hot water to soften them up for the lathe. And what a lathe it is. This machine is turning the whole log against a sharp knife, which reduces it to a ribbon of wood in seconds. I've never seen anything like it. At this station, defects are cut out of the ribbon of veneer. The operation happens quickly and is controlled by an overhead sensor and a computer. The remaining veneer is chopped into approximately 4-foot sections, but the scraps are not thrown away. Another conveyor line carries them here to this machine, where they are stitched into 4-foot sections with hot melt glue, a technique that any Yankee would admire. Throw nothing out. Now for the assembly, the plywood ballet. Watch as these 3 workers put the panels together. Now if we slow the process down, watch what is happening here. The 2 men in white are loading core panels onto the table. The man in blue takes another core which has just been glued on both sides. This continues until the lamination is complete and ready for the hardwood skins. Now watch the two men in white again. They now grab a pair of hardwood skins from the top of the pile. In this case, it's cherry. One will become the face veneer of a completed panel, the other the bottom of the next. You really need to pay attention on this job. So this is the whole sandwich, the bread, the cheese, the ham, the whole work.
That's right.
Then it's off to this vertical press where heat and pressure is applied to set the plywood panels. Up to now, the panels have been a little bit oversized. So here they are recut to finish width and length. An industrial strength belt sander is used here to dimension the thickness and to perfect the surface. Then it's off to quality control.
Well, what's happening here, Jeff?
Norm, this is the end of the line. This is where we'll strap up the load and ship it off. This is a load of cherry right here.
All right, that's beautiful. It's one of my favorite woods. Well, thanks for the tour.
Well, you're very welcome, Norm. I appreciate you coming.
Now, I don't need this whole lift right away at the new Yankee Workshop. Half will do for now.
That's a lot of plywood.
I'm still waiting for the rest of that lift of plywood. So far, I've only got 6 sheets. Well, that was a very interesting story. Meanwhile, back here, I've been sizing the pieces for the top. I've kept them in sequential order so the grain will match when it's all finished. I'm going to have to conceal the core edges of the plywood, and I'll do that with some solid 1-inch strips of mahogany mitered at the corners. But before I do that, I want to show you what's going on under this center panel where I have to do a little more work. The mirror is hinged at the top and has this little prop which supports it at this angle. In order for the prop to have someplace to go when the mirror is closed, I had to route out this center section. And in order to provide some more room for the mirror frame, I made a shallow 1/8 inch cut around the perimeter. I'll do that first. To create the relief area for the mirror frame, I'm using the dado head. It's set at 1/8 of an inch height, and I'll have to make a couple passes. I've just laid out for this recess for the mirror support, and I'm going to remove that material using my router. Now, the first thing that I did is I made a little gauge block, and that's equal to the distance from the edge of my router base to the edge of the bit. And what that does for me is it makes it unnecessary to measure every time I set up this straight edge. I simply set the gauge to the line, lock it in place. Now I guide the router and start removing the material. With the perimeter outlined, now it's just a matter of taking a chisel and popping out the section in the middle. Well, now it's time to trim out the edges of all the plywood top pieces. So I've ripped some 1-inch stock, carefully mitered the corners, and cut biscuit slots both in the plywood and the solid trim. Now I adjusted the slots so that the solid wood will be just slightly higher than the veneer. If it was lower and I went to sand everything even, I just burn right through it. This way I'll bring the wood, solid wood, to the plywood. Let's take another look at the prototype and this mirror support. It's hinged on some tiny hinges, and the joint is just a simple half lap. By simply using my saw blade, I just nibble away the material at each half lap. All right, a little bit of glue on the half lap, and you just tap them together. I don't think I'll need any clamps for this. Here I've installed a 1/2-inch cove bit in my router table, and I've machined a finger pull on the bottom inside edge of the mirror. That way it'll be easier to lift it forward. Here I'm mortising for the hinges that will allow the mirror to pivot. I've just scored a line with a mat knife. I'm removing the bulk of the material with my router, and I'll clean it up with a sharp chisel. Now these little hinges are going to attach the support to the back of the mirror frame. These mortises are for hinges that are going to attach the center frame to the top. Well, I still have a little more mortising, a few more pieces of hardware to put on, and some final sanding, plus putting on a finish. But it's getting late, so that can wait till tomorrow. I don't want to rush it. Hi again. A lot of progress already this morning. The first thing that I did was to make some corresponding mortises in the top to receive the hinges from the mirror assembly. Next, I made a mortise for this piece of hardware. This is the piece that keeps the mirror assembly from tipping back too far. I used a straight edge and a 3/8-inch bit in my plunge router. Made a mortise about 3/4 of an inch deep, so that piece fits in like that. And then I made a corresponding hole in the mirror assembly for this plug, which gets epoxied in later. The next thing that I did was to work on some bullet catches that hold the mirror from falling down. One piece goes in the side of the mirror, another piece goes in the outer frame. The next thing that I want to do is treat the edges of the top. Cut a profile over at the router table. For the top edge, I've used an OG bit. Now I'm going to change bits and take care of the bottom edge with a 1/4 round. Okay, now with a little glue on the inside of that mirror frame, I can attach it to the center section of the top. And carefully line it up, making sure the edges are flush, and secure it with some 1 1/4-inch brads. This is a little trim piece that I'm installing right here down at the bottom edge of that outer frame. It has a finger cut out, and I made that the same way I made the one in the mirror frame. I'll just attach it with a couple brads. Okay, now I'm attaching the whole mirror and center top assembly to the base, just reinstalling the screws in the hinge. Now, I'm in no hurry to epoxy this piece of hardware into the top. I'll do that after I do the finishing. I want this out of the way. Now we just close it down, and that takes care of the center. Now I've taken a few minutes to install the end panels of the top. I carefully adjust it to this center section, which can't move now, so that I have a nice even gap, and I secure them with some 1 5/8 screws through some pre-drilled holes. The first step in finishing our dressing table is to stain it. I'm using an oil-based stain. The color is mahogany. Most antique pieces that you see that are built out of mahogany tend to be really dark. So putting on this stain will give us that look. Now I simply apply a nice even coat on each area, let it set for a few minutes, and then take a rag and wipe off the excess. After I get the complete table done, we'll let it sit overnight. Okay, now for a top coat. And what I'm using is probably what was used on that antique at the Biltmore Estate, shellac. I like using shellac because it dries very quickly, so fast that it doesn't attract much dust. And the idea is to build up several coats, probably at least a half a dozen. And I can do it very quickly between coats because it dries so fast. Well, this should be the final coat of shellac. I've been blocking the piece down with some microfine paper between coats. After this dries, we'll be ready for the hardware. The first piece of hardware that I'm going to put on are these solid brass casters, very similar to the ones we saw on the antique at Biltmore. I was able to order them from my mail order woodworker's catalog. I got lucky on the knobs. These replicas are very close to the ones on the original. Found out the hard way that I have to pre-drill for these nails before I put the mirror in. And then I just use a dowel to push it in enough just to hold it. Well, there it is, the dressing table. Maybe I'll call my friends down at the Biltmore Estate. Who knows? They may want to put it on display. It was a fun project to build, and it's going to become an heirloom in my family.